Okay, good afternoon. This is April 30th, 2021, Berlin. My name is Mischa Honeck. I am a professor of British and North American history at the University of Kassel, and it is a distinct pleasure for me to join the 2021 Children's History Society conference at the invitation of the great Simon SLEIGHT, who has ably organized a panel on the question of how to best rethink agency in children's history, which I think is a great idea at a time when the world has taken a renewed interest in the historical subjectivities of young people in the context of the Friday for Future movement and kindred activist impulses that come from the smallest members of our society. So my job today is to provide a modest contribution on the ongoing discussions about how to critique, expand, and enrich discussions about the agency of young people in history, which I think hopefully will spill over in other parts of our discipline, because the question of how and why and when people act and become active as historical subjects, of course, is something that extends to various corners of the historical profession. The title of my talk is Eigen-Sinn, A Way Out of the Agency Trap. It must have been 2 a.m. when George Royland and Sam Neill yanked 15-year-old Walter Ong out of a deep sleep. The 3 Boy Scouts from the American Midwest had been traveling across Europe after participating in the 1929 World Scout Jamboree in Birkenhead, England. Acquaintance had grown into friendship. A scout is friendly. But then Cologne happened. Parting from their troop, George and Sam snuck out of the hostel after dinner to experience the city at night. Their outing had a wet ending. The boys joined a drinking bout at a nearby pub. A scout is clean. That his friends burst into the room in the middle of the night did not bother Walter. What infuriated him was that the two came back drunk. And about teetotaler, Walter could not let such behavior slide. The scout is trustworthy. The next morning, he reported George and Sam to his scoutmaster. To Walter's dismay, the adult felt no need to reprimand the revelers. Walter's sense of justice only hardened. He wrote an angry letter to Kansas City Scout executive demanding that George and Sam be disciplined. A scout is obedient. That pretty much was the end of their friendship. And the summer vacation had turned sour. Why? Because of a few glasses of beer, sanctimoniousness, and all of the spontaneous self-will, prankishness, and obstinate behavior that lay in between. For the academic custodians of Eigen-Sinn, self-will, prankishness, and obstinacy are familiar buzzwords. The man who gave them an analytical heft was Alf Lu, one of the pioneers of Alltagsgeschichte. Originating at the interstices of social history and anthropology, this particular approach to writing the history of everyday life became popular in the 1980s with a small group of West German historians who wanted to alter the scale of observation. What united these academic rebels was a healthy distrust of traditional mass narratives and broad-brushed structural analysis. Lütke's concern was that our understanding of modern history would be impoverished unless historians adjusted their lenses. Their focus should be on smarter units of investigation, on the ways in which ordinary, seemingly subordinate peoples made sense of the stratified life worlds they inhabited. Against the epistemological currency of systems and statistics, terms that back then enjoyed a high standing in mainstream social history, against these terms, Lütke pitted the explanatory force of local practice and subjective experience. Eigen-Sinn was forged in this fiery methodological furnace. My guess is that few English language scholars have encountered the term before, let alone in the context of childhood studies. There are understandable reasons for that. The concept is notoriously German. It's hard to define and even harder to translate. Some liken Eigen-Sinn to a planet in the solar system of agency, but I think it rather resembles a comet streaking right through it. In a rare English language glossary entry, Lütke described Eigen-Sinn as, quote, a kind of self-affirmation, an act of reappropriating alienated social relations on and off the shop floor by self-assertive prankishness, demarcating a space of one's own. End quote. That sentence contains a few insights and a productive irony. Lütke's usage of the term shop floor shows that he cared first and foremost about workers, industrial workers to be precise. Like other historians of his generation, Lütke felt pressed to explain how large parts of the German working class had fallen in line with the National Socialists. Wading through his records, he realized that he had entered an ocean of human activity that could not be subsumed under the crude rubrics of resistance or support. Instead, Lütke unearthed much more nuanced behaviors that demonstrated the ability of peoples entangled in regimes of domination and discipline to retain some degree of autonomy. Hence the emphasis on appropriation, which Lütke deployed as an umbrella term of sorts for how humans sought to navigate, to negotiate, and adapt to the exigencies of hierarchies not entirely of their own making. The appropriators can be as varied as their attitudes. They run the gamut from the zeal of glowing idealists or the egoistic exploitation of the possibilities of active participation, to outwardly loyal but inwardly distant attitudes, to passive forms of noncompliance or open dissidence. At its core, Eigen-Sinn is a yardstick for measuring social and culturally balancing acts. Ethical considerations played a role from the start. Many of Eigen-Sinn's proponents hail the concept as a methodological attempt to do justice to the rank and file who, in different historical moments, quote, tried to be themselves while at the same time trying to be with others, end quote. Where are children and youths in all of this? This is where we get to the productive irony. Eigen-Sinn was made by adults for adults, yet children always lurked in the background. Lütke wanted them to stay there. He cast factory workers as mature actors who possessed dignity and took pride in their labor, not as powerless victims or clueless cogs in a giant machine. To de-infantilize his subjects, Lütke felt that he had to detach Eigen-Sinn from childhood, at least in part. He resorted to a form of semiotic distancing, inserting a hyphen between Eigen, which can be translated as own or individual, literally, and Sinn, which literally translates into sense or meaning. That hyphen, Lütke anticipated, would unlock different vectors of meaning, ones that would make the term conducive to his agenda and jettison unfavorable semantic baggage. But this was a game of whack-a-mole that Lütke could not win, and was probably wrong to play in the first place. Consider the etymology of eigensinnig, the adjective. Its original meaning as stubborn in German is captured quite gruesomely in The Willful Child, a German folk tale collected by the Grimm brothers in the early 19th century. The tale tells the story of a little girl who disobeyed her mother until she fell ill with a deadly disease. In a later version, it was God who punishes the girl for her transgressions. But the girl's obstinacy continued beyond the grave. Her arm kept reaching upward and had to be forced back into the ground several times. Only after the mother had struck the arm with a rod did the girl rest in peace. More modern usages of Eigen-Sinn, with or without the hyphen, have moderated such negative connotations. However, its association with kids who are somehow not all right, unruly, or simply different, even when highly gifted, remains alive and well. This is where Lütke and his disciples see a dead end. I don't. I see the contours of a fruitful conversation, the seeds of which Lütke had planted himself. Do you recall the expression self-assertive prankishness? The phrase evokes the image of a naughty child, but Lütke, whether intentional or not, uses it to highlight unchildlike modes of, quote, putting up with power to the degree that one must, while pursuing one's ends to the degree that one can. Does this not aptly describe what historians of childhood are dealing with all the time? It's not the desire, and in many cases, the ability of us to carve out, no, not of us, but of the children, excuse me, is it not the ability to carve out semi-independent spaces in the hierarchical environments of family, school, and the state, one of the chief provinces of modern youth? I believe that Eigen-Sinn and childhood have a lot more to tell, nay, to give each other. I'm going to spend the remainder of my time reflecting on how Eigen-Sinn can enrich current debates about agency in our field. My point of view, to be sure, is both informed and limited by my work as a historian of organized youth in general, and of the Boy Scouts of America in particular. Experts on other topics might disagree or arrive at different conclusions. My hope is that by embracing the benefits of such an intervention, we might discover another conceptual bridge across the artificial canyon that allegedly separates the history of youth and childhood from, quote unquote, not my term, normal history. This would be no small achievement, especially in light of Sarah Mazza's recent AHR piece, in which she amplified the claim that much of our research remains marginal, if not overrated. Let's return to Walter, George, and Sam for a moment. The dispute over what a good scout should or should not be doing confronts us with conflicting agential positions that, I argue, might be better analyzed through the lens of Eigen-Sinn. Self-will seems obvious in the case of George and Sam, and we might find it easy to empathize with what may strike us as familiar teenage behavior. More important for our purposes is that the Eigen-Sinn exhibited by the two boys straddled two subject positions. That of being stately representatives of America's leading character-building organization for boys on foreign soil, and that of two adolescents seeking pleasure abroad. Universal definitions of agency stressing resistance or waywardness will fail to account for this balancing act. We have every reason to believe that the boys enjoyed every minute at the pub without questioning their identity as scouts or relinquishing their assent to the organization's demands. Walter's response betrayed a different kind of self-assertion, but one that can be equally understood as a form of reappropriation. For Walter, scouting and drinking represented two utterly irreconcilable visions of youth. But it was only after realizing that his scoutmaster did not share his rather fundamentalist reading of the scout law that Walter too moved into a space of his own. It was his way of coping with a temporary sense of alienation. For him, reestablishing a meaningful relationship to an institution and precepts of upright boyhood that he complied with so enthusiastically meant doubling down on criticizing the transgressors, regardless of age. Walter's moral fervor was his mischief. Again, Eigen-Sinn helps us to capture behaviors of rank-and-file youths that elude either or in or out binaries. Some semi-autonomous spaces exist on the fringes of a system of authority. Others can form rigid enclaves in their midst. One of the greatest advantages of Eigen-Sinn is that it alerts us to the radical unpredictability of our subjects. Over the past decades, historians working on youth organizations across the totalitarian liberal divide have chipped away at the caricature of ununiformed adolescents simply marching in lockstep with their leaders. But when we extol dissent or rebelliousness as the truest or highest expressions of youthful agency, we also run the risk of pushing the envelope too far in the other direction. Take the example of the Americanist Jay Meckling, who famously characterized youth organizations as sites of intergenerational struggle, an arena rocked by frequent tugs of war between, quote, adult intentions and youth's desire to exercise as much autonomy as possible. End quote. This is an empirically questionable juxtaposition. And this model echoes the faulty assumption that youth organizations and youth culture are somehow incompatible. Eigen-Sinn can take us beyond these zero-sum calculations. At best, it can teach us to appreciate modes of action that may seem trivial because they spring from impulses that are different from the dictates of group loyalty, but also diverge from the logic of permanent separation. Still, these impulses and the way that historical subjects adhere to their own agendas carry important lessons. Number one, that there are realms of ungovernability in institutions, no matter how tightly regulated. Number two, that the Eigen-Sinn of even their smallest members can destabilize or stabilize existing power relations. And three, that straying from the script is not tantamount to abandoning it. Of course, the child is never just a child, and explorations of young people's Eigen-Sinn cannot be divorced from disparities of power, place, and belonging. The proponents of Alltagsgeschichte will say that they always take into account where people are located in social hierarchies. My hunch is that they stand to benefit from an exchange with childhood scholars who have delivered robust intersectional analyses with a more nuanced attention to age and stages of development. Both categories impact the ability of a young person to act eigensinnig, but so do the overlapping inequalities of class, of gender, of race, and of sexuality. Historians of childhood could help to spell out the relative element in individual and collective acts of reappropriation, relative insofar as young people never create pockets of idiosyncrasy independently of the various structures of difference surrounding them. Looking back at my work on the Boy Scouts, and I'm concluding my talk with this reflection here, looking back at my own work, Eigen-Sinn turned out to be a much more effective instrument for getting a grip on my young actors than any holistic concept of agency could have done. I just wish I had applied it more thoroughly. It's not to say that the approach is without blind spots or limitations. Buying into Eigen-Sinn means buying into microhistory with all its pros and cons. If you are bent on examining normative trends, long-term patterns, or long-durée transformations, compiling an archipelago of actor-centered close-ups might not be your first choice. Still, I believe that Eigen-Sinn's assets far outweigh its liabilities. It accommodates the kind of spontaneity, the impulsivity, the ambiguity, and even the fleeting anarchy that flourishes outside rigid conceptions of individual and collective identity. Boy Scouts saluted, cheered, embraced their elders as brothers, but they just as often sniggered, yawned, burped, messed around, much to the men's irritation, flirted with girls. More often than not, I found them darting sideways, lingering in the rear, or racing ahead, only to fall back in line. They did all this, and still they did not vanish into something else. Perhaps the child is the father of man after all. Thank you very much for paying attention, and I hope to see many of you. This is Radio Nowhere here, but I hope to see many of you in June for our Q&A, and it would be a great pleasure. Stay safe, and hopefully talk to you soon. Goodbye.